Hello, everybody. I hope you're enjoying your Tuesday. Excuse me. As I said on Sunday or yesterday, I'm recording all these on the same day, so don't mind me wearing the same shirt, which really is not a cute pre-recorded meeting shirt. I'm learning next week I'll wear a different one. Okay, so today we're going to talk about life on a plantation and what it was like to actually be a slave living on a plantation. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is one of my favorite books, one of my favorite memoirs, and it's the story of Frederick Douglass, who was a slave. He was born a slave and escaped slavery, and then went on to be an abolitionist and write a lot of really important works about ending slavery. So I'm going to read some of his explanation of what life was like on a plantation and talk through that, and then share with you the resource that you're going to be using for today's assignment. So let me go to sharing my screen. I think I clicked on it, and here is the text. So for now, you just get to kind of chill for a sec and listen while I read this. I'm going to stop and talk through it. This is chapter 2 of the book, where Frederick Douglass is explaining the plantation that he was born into. He ends up living in a lot of different places as a slave, but this is his first looking at the plantation. So I'm starting here. It says Colonel Lloyd. You can just listen or follow along. Colonel Lloyd kept, remember this word is not colonial, it's colonel. I know that's one of those very tricky words. Colonel Lloyd kept from 300 to 400 slaves on his home plantation and owned a large number more on the neighboring farms belonging to him. The names of the farms nearest to the home plantation were Y Town and New Design. Y Town was under the overseership of a man named Noah Willis. New Design was under the overseership of a Mr. Townsend. The overseers of these and all the rest of the farms, numbering over 20, received advice and direction from the managers of the home plantation. This was the great business place. It was the seat of government for the whole 20 farms. All disputes among the overseers were settled here. If a slave was convicted for any high misdemeanor, which would be a crime, became unmanageable, or evinced a determination to run away, he was brought immediately here, severely whipped, put on board the sloop, carried to Baltimore, and sold to Austin Woolfolk or some other slave trader as a warning to the slaves remaining. So he's explaining the government of the plantation. Obviously, this plantation would have still existed within a state. The state would have had a governor. It was still within the United States, but these plantations really were like little mini cities that were almost self-sufficient in and of themselves. And they had a whole um, system of the person at the top in the hierarchy, and who did they report to, and who did they report to, and who are the overseers. And so not every person who owned a slave had these large plantations, but I would say that the majority of slaves in the South lived on one of these. You can see there were 300 to 400 just on his home plantation, and then there were 20 other farms that were part of this whole organization. So really just a lot of slaves, enough that a person, a slave owner, a plantation owner, could just sell a slave who was wanting to escape. They could just get rid of them, send them on their way. You see a lot in these accountings, just a very clear lack of understanding and lack of belief that the lives of the slaves were equal to the lives of the people. They really truly believed that they owned them. And I would say even in a the lives of the slaves held a less of a standard even than like the pets that we own today. You know, we say we own our pets, but I would say that the slave owners gave less of a held the regard of the lives of their slaves at an even lower level than we hold our pets, which is uh, pretty abysmal, considering pets are animals and we're talking about actual people with feelings and all that. So that's an interesting explanation of the overseerships and all the people who worked for Colonel Lloyd. Here, too, the slaves of all the other farms received their monthly allowance of food and their yearly clothing. I believe this was very standard. You would get food for the month, and then you would get clothing for the year as a slave. And they would, in this case, they went to the what do they call it? The home plantation? No, that's not where they call. Well, that's not what they called it. Oh yeah, the home plantation to receive that, which would be Colonel Lloyd's, the sort of center of it all. The men and women slaves received as their monthly allowance of food 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent in fish and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen jackets, 1 pair of linen trousers, like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter, made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. The allowance of the slave children was given to their mothers or the old woman having the care of them. The children unable to work in the fields had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given to them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. When these failed them, they went naked until the next allowance day. Children from 7 to 10 years old of both sexes, almost naked, might be seen at all seasons of the year. There were no beds given the slaves, unless 1 coarse blanket be considered such, and none but the men and women had these. This, however, is not considered a very great privation. That would mean like a very great deprivation, actually. It was not considered something that they were lacking. They find less difficulty from the want of beds than from the want of time to sleep. So what Frederick Douglass is saying is not having a bed was actually not something that people complained about, but what was harder on the slaves was not having time to sleep. So because they didn't get enough time to sleep, that was a bigger issue than not having a bed. For when their day's work in the field is done, the most of them having their washing, mending, and cooking to do, and having few or none of the ordinary facilities for doing either of these, very many of their sleeping hours were consumed in preparing for the field the coming day. And when this is done, old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down side by side on one common bed, the cold, damp floor, each covering himself or herself with their miserable blankets, and here they sleep till they are summoned to the field by the driver's horn. At the sound of this, all must rise and be off to the field. There must be no halting. Everyone must be at his or her post, and woe betides, so kind of too bad or bad luck, them who hear not this morning's summons to the field. For if they are not awakened by the sense of hearing, they are by the sense of feeling. No age nor sex finds any favor. Mr. Severe, the overseer, used to stand by the door of the quarter, armed with a large hickory stick and heavy cowskin, ready to whip anyone who was so unfortunate as not to hear, or from any other cause was prevented from being ready for the field at the start of the horn. So he's sort of describing what their day is. They were so tired from working in the field all day, and then they would come home and they'd still have their lives to take care of. They still had, a home. Oftentimes was a shack, but they still want to wash their clothes, feed themselves, cook dinner, all those things that they would have to do. But that by the time it was time to go to sleep, they would just fall asleep on the floor, and it didn't matter that they didn't have a bed. This goes on. Mr. Severe is actually an important figure in the story. By the way, I was going to say this before. This is a true story. This is Frederick Douglass's accounting of his life. So all the things that are in this story actually happened. I'm going to skip these 2 parts. Okay, I'm going to go down to this part because I think these are a very important part of the lives of slaves. Basically, that if you didn't do what you were told to do, you would be beaten terribly by the overseer. And that was absolutely true. There are images of the backs of slaves just covered in welts from being whipped so many times. And that was how they were sort of controlled, was through fear and dehumanization. And we'll talk a little bit more about dehumanization in the next lecture that I'm going to do. But I want to get this idea of what the plantation was like. And I think this next paragraph is one of the best paragraphs for that, for even me. When I read this book, it kind of clarified it for me. So I'm going to read this paragraph and then we'll go into, maybe I'll read the next 2 paragraphs. Then we'll go into what you're going to do for today. The home plantation of Colonel Lloyd wore the appearance of a country village. I'm right here if you're following along. All the mechanical operations for all the farms were performed here. The shoemaking and mending, the blacksmithing, cart riding, coopering, weaving, and grain grinding. So blacksmithing would be like making metal things. Cart riding, I'm assuming, is fixing the plows. I'm just guessing here. I don't know for sure. I don't know what coopering is. Weaving would be making cloth. Grain grinding would be turning the grain into flour for bread. Were all performed by the slaves on the home plantation. The whole place wore a business-like aspect very unlike the neighboring farms. The number of houses, too, conspired to give it advantage over the neighboring farms. It was called by the slaves the Great House Farm. Few privileges were esteemed higher by the slaves of the out farms than that of being selected to do errands at the Great House Farm. It was associated in their minds with greatness. A representative could not be prouder of his election to a seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of the out farms would be of his election to do errands at the Great House Farm. So being able to go to sort of the business center of the plantation was a huge honor. They regarded it as evidence of great confidence reposed in them by their overseers, and it was on this account, as well as a constant desire to be out of the field from under the driver's lash, that they esteemed it a high privilege, one worth careful living for. He was called the smartest and most trusty fellow who had this honor conferred upon him the most frequently. The competitors for this office sought as diligently to please their overseers as the office seekers in the political parties seek to please and deceive the people. The same traits of character might be seen in Colonel Lloyd's slaves as seen in the slaves of the political parties. So here, Frederick Douglass is making a bit of a parallel between slaves in a plantation to people in politics, and how they may act in a certain way to get the favor of their constituents, or to move higher up in politics. He's being a little I would say sarcastic here, and making fun of people in politics. So yeah, obviously had a certain opinion about politicians. But he is explaining what the sort of house slaves had a higher hierarchy among the field slaves. And this is important because whenever you can give sort of perceived privileges to people and have them buy into that system, then they're more likely to stay within the system. And I think a lot of people ask, sort of, or may wonder, how did slavery last for so long? There's countless examples of slaves fighting back. So it's not like it was just accepted and went along with it for hundreds of years without saying anything. There was definitely plenty of unhappiness with it. But I think the idea of sort of giving people something to work for within the system, it's a psychological trick, and it keeps people more invested in it. Like, oh, if I just do what I'm supposed to do, then maybe I can get to go see the Great House Farm. This happened. The Nazis did this during in the ghettos during World War II. There were certain people in the ghettos who were selected to enforce the laws, and they were given more privilege. There were certain people in the concentration camps who were given more privileges over others, and this idea of like you can earn something within this system, I think is a psychological way of keeping people there. It's pretty sick and twisted, but it is part of it. Even if you've read The Hunger Games, for a while there, they are using Katniss. Both sides are using Katniss as a symbol for the rebellion, and then also for the capital, to try and control her, to try and keep the people in line. So a lot of this is just the powers that be trying to keep people in line. So that was all seen in the plantation. And I'm going to stop there. This is such a good book. I want to read the whole thing to you, but I'm not going to. What I want to show you is this is what you're going to be reading today. I know it says Teacher's Activity Guide up here. You can, I found it, and I don't know how to, where it doesn't say Teacher's Activity Guide, so I just shared that with you. This is some words and writing from Fannie Moore. She was born in South Carolina in 1849, and she told her story in 1937 when she was 88. So she told the story of growing up on a plantation. So you can read through this, and there's some questions that are listed in the assignment to sort of get more of an idea of this plantation life. As I said, this was not the life for every slave. There were some slaves that maybe worked for a farmer who had a very small plot of land, who maybe it was just them, just one slave. There were certainly plenty of slaves who were incredibly close to their masters. Who there were slaves who, when they were going to abolish slavery, were against the idea of abolishing slavery. They didn't want to abolish it. They felt it was the best system for them to live their life. So uh, this sort of slave master overseer whipping the slaves, working in the fields, that's not the only experience, but I do think it's a very, I don't think, I know it's a very common experience. And if we're getting a sense of what slavery was like, I think it's a good experience to examine, to get a sense of what it was like. There are a lot of nuances to slavery. I think we've talked about this before, and you'll probably notice this in your timeline from yesterday, that that Black people were allowed to own slaves, which kind of brings us back to that issue of like, it's not really about race always, it's about power and feeling that some people can be better than others for a variety of reasons. I think that there are many nuances, but sort of as we move through this idea of like many slaves lived on a plantation and this is what it's like, that's important to understand. So read through this sheet or this page here and fill out the sheet in Google Classroom. And that's sort of the understanding of what slavery was. I'll go to stop sharing. Hi and bye, and I'll talk to you soon.